Welcome and good morning. And I'm really delighted that everyone has been able to join us today for what will prove to be a really fun, interesting, and intellectually engaging conversation. My name is Adam Mossoff, and I am a senior fellow and chair of the Forum for Intellectual Property at the Hudson Institute. And I'm really happy today to have as a guest speaking about his recently published book, How Innovation Works and How It Flourishes in Freedom, Matt Ridley. Welcome, Matt.
Adam, thank you very much for having me on your show.
Oh, delighted that you came on. For those who may not know, Matt is the author of a recently published book that, as I mentioned, How Innovation Works, of which this discussion is going to focus on. He's also the author of many other books, including also The Rational Optimist, that relate to science and human progress more generally. Collectively, they have sold well over 1 million copies worldwide, and he is an award-winning author as a result. He's also a biologist, newspaper columnist, and a member of the House of Lords in the United Kingdom. I won't go on about his many other accolades and achievements in his life. For you, I want to hear us talking about the ideas in his book and not me discuss what is easily achievable using and embracing an innovation that we all have access to today. The internet, you can easily Google him and discover all of his incredible achievements and insights that he has to offer. So without much further ado, let's jump in, Matt.
Great.
So your book, and I actually have a copy in what we now call dead tree format. I'm a little bit old school, as I can see behind you as well, and as me a little bit. That we want to still have some of our books that we can write in by hand.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, the interesting thing is the publishing industry 10 years ago was more interested in ebooks than it is today. It's gone back to the book being the main product it produces and the ebook being a side issue. It's quite interesting. Audiobooks, though, have increased hugely in importance.
Yeah, I'm a consumer of audiobooks. Love them. But you're exactly right.
On this occasion, I actually recorded my new book on audio. It was a four-day marathon inside my linen closet with duvets hung around me to deaden the sound. It was a wonderful experience in some ways. It was rather sort of Buddhist.
And the best of kind of the mix of modern technology and old world jury rigging of sound stages.
Exactly.
Yes. So I want to kick off with a general question about your book, given that some of the people watching this may not have read it yet, although everyone should. Everyone certainly should purchase it. It's a really interesting, fascinating survey of innovation and how it flourishes, and all the different contexts in which innovation has contributed to not just making modern life a veritable miracle by any historical standard, but the ways in which it has come about. Now, the book, though, is primarily comprised of case studies of innovation ranging across history. You talk about the steamship, and the light bulb, and nuclear power, shipping containers, food, everything. It's amazing. And these stories really drive home this kind of broader theoretical point that innovation flourishes in political and economic freedom. And so, could you describe for us a little bit why you chose to focus on particular stories of innovation as the way to convey the broader theoretical point of the book?
Well, there were two reasons. One was because I like reading stories, and I think most people like reading stories. And if you set out to write a book about a theory, and every now and then you drop in a non-abstract example, I don't think you catch as many people's attention as if you set out with a bunch of really interesting, gripping stories, and then you let the theory emerge. And so that was the second reason. I really wanted to be, I think the word is inductive about this. I wanted to start with the data. Data is the wrong word. I start with the anecdotes, the stories, and see what patterns emerged. I was pretty sure that I knew what patterns would emerge, but rather than write the theory and then use case histories to exemplify it, I wanted to use case histories to teach me the theory. And I feel it worked well. So the first half of the book, as you say, is really just stories, about sort of 5 or 6 stories each chapter about different innovations, how they came about, what impact they had, who was involved, who they had to collaborate with to achieve their achievements, et cetera, et cetera. And then I dig into the meat of the argument in having a chapter called Innovation's Essentials, another about the economics of innovation, another about resistance to innovation, another about innovation failures, and so on. So then from then on, the book is actually a more conventional argument, buttressed by examples. But I was trying to be data-led, anecdote-led.
Anecdotes are a type of data.
Yes, there's a great saying in scientists: the plural of anecdote is not data.
Yeah. but it is an excellent approach. I embrace it heartily myself in my own scholarship as well, as someone who studies the history of innovation and the history of intellectual property. I'm known as the sewing machine guy for my in-depth study of the rise of the invention of the sewing machine by Elias Howe and Singer and others in the United States. Do you have a favorite story of innovation from the book that you came across?
I think probably the one, I mean, the one I keep coming back to because it's such a beautiful story is the Wright brothers, how they did everything right and Samuel Langley did everything wrong at the same time. And you know, they're just such a wonderful example of humble bicycle makers from Dayton, Ohio. But I think rather than tell that, because most people know the outlines of that story, the one that intrigued me the most, because it's more up to date and it's more surprising in many ways, is the story of the mosquito net impregnated with insecticide. This is the single technology that has reversed the increase in malaria. Malaria was getting worse in the 1990s. Around 2003, it stopped getting worse and started getting better. And it's now halved as a cause of mortality in the world, despite rising population, despite warming climate and all these kind of things, which is an incredible turnaround. You know, this disease was forecast 20 years ago to get worse and worse in this century. In fact, it's getting better and better. And by far the largest reason for that is this one low-tech, simple technology that if you impregnate a mosquito net with insecticide and you then give it away or sell it cheaply throughout Africa, it doesn't matter how many tears there are in it after a week or two, it'll still work because it's a huge deterrent. And this came about because of a very simple but rather beautifully designed experiment by a bunch of French scientists in Burkina Faso in the mid-1980s, which discovered that these things were unbelievably good at deterring mosquitoes, making them highlight out of a hut as soon as they got in there rather than stay in it. So it's a very nice example of something really quite cheap and low tech. Nobody's made any money out of it. The Gates Foundation championed this technology and poured money into it. But I'm sure the manufacturers of mosquito nets have made some money out of it. But nobody's got a Nobel Prize out of it, or as far as I know, there's no patents on it. It's a very simple and interesting story that has saved a lot of lives.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it was a fascinating story to read, and you know, and it's an interesting example of innovation in response to a prior depressing of innovation, as you talked about in the context of not specifically mosquitoes, but in the context of just
insecticides.
Insecticide, yes, because DDT was effectively eliminating malaria as well until it got banned in response by a lot of the forces that you talk about in your book, the safety risk concerns that are raised and things of that sort.
And in the context of the current pandemic, it's quite an interesting story too, because you know, if the Gates Foundation hadn't championed that technology, I think malaria would be a growing problem still. What does that tell us? I mean, I actually had this argument with Bill Gates once because he was saying, how dare you think that foreign aid is a bad idea? You know, look at what we're achieving with the aid that we're doing at the Gates Foundation. I said, no, you prove exactly the opposite. You prove that governments have been pouring money into foreign aid for decades, and they didn't even turn around malaria. You come along and you champion the right technology, not the wrong one, and you do it in the right way, and you don't give all the money to NGOs in the West, and you don't give it to corrupt dictators in the developing world. You actually make sure that the money gets to the right place and does the right thing. You actually shame the world of official aid giving and show it how it should have been done. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I don't know whether I won that argument, but it was enjoyable to have because it was a compliment disguised as a criticism.
Well, it's really good to hear that you are giving people like Bill Gates the intellectual ammunition that they need to defend the types of work that they're important work that they're doing.
Well, I'm not sure Bill Gates really listens to me, but we've interacted a couple of times.
That's good. So it's interesting. You talked about how you wanted to focus on the stories of innovation, how innovation actually came about in various contexts and in various sectors of the economy and throughout history as a way to be inductive, and as a way to draw from the facts, how actually innovation develops and how it occurs, which is the theme of your book, How Innovation Works. Um, and um, and it's very interesting to note that one of the insights that you draw is not just that innovation itself is an inductive ground up process. You can't dictate it by giving money to governments, and governments are horrible predictors of where technology is going to be. In fact, business persons tend to be really horrible predictors of where innovation is going to occur. Um, but you do recognize and make the case for innovation as constituting a collective enterprise. Were you surprised by that discovery, or was this one of the things that you already had thought you might find in the historical data as you kind of dug into the stories?
I think I was expecting to find that because I'm very influenced by that sort of Hayekian idea that the knowledge is dispersed in society. It's not held inside individual heads, it's shared between them.
Mm-hmm.
That essay by Leonard Reed, I Pencil, is just a beautiful example of reminding us how there's a collective brain that runs the world through the market. It's not how to run the world is not held inside individual heads, it's held between heads. This goes right back to Bastiat and How to Feed Paris and all that kind of thing. So I was expecting, given the role of distributed intelligence in running the world, that distributed intelligence would play a huge part in innovating in the world too. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, I was pleasantly surprised by how often stories that seemed purely individual, when you drilled down, turned out to be much more collective. So take Norman Borlaug, the inventor of dwarf varieties of wheat, which transformed particularly India and Pakistan from starving countries to super abundant in food countries between the mid-1960s and the mid-1970s very rapidly. And they did so because Borlaug had done a series of experiments in Mexico to develop these short-strawed wheat varieties that had much higher yields and could cope with fertilizer better and produce higher yields as a result. And Borlaug is a great hero, and he's probably saved more lives than anyone else, including Bill Gates. But he got the Nobel Peace Prize, et cetera, And I'm not trying to take anything away from him, but it's very important to set him in context. So I said, look, where did he get the idea of the short-strawed wheat varieties from? Well, he got it from a conversation in Argentina at a conference with a guy called Burton Bales. Burton Bales, I tried to find out about him. He's a pretty obscure agronomist working in the American Midwest. But he had visited a guy called Orville Vogel in Oregon, who was growing these short-strawed varieties and trying to cross them with other varieties. And Vogel had got them from a guy called Cecil Salmon, who was on MacArthur's staff in Japan at the end of the World War II. And he had visited some Japanese agricultural experimental stations, and he'd found these dwarf wheat varieties, bonsai wheat, if you like. And where had the Japanese got them? Well, a guy called Gonjiro Inuzuka had developed them and crossed them in the 1920s. So the trail has gone way back now, 40, 50 years, and there it's lost in the mist of time. We don't know where Gonjiro Inuzuka got them, but there was some hint that he got them from Korea. So maybe it goes even further back. I might be able to follow this story right back to ancient Rome or something, for all I know. And then if you want to take the story forward, Borlaug couldn't do this on his own. He had to persuade champions in both India and Pakistan to adopt these varieties, and a guy called Swaminathan in India was particularly crucial in that story, etc. So it's a lovely example of teamwork, and Borlaug deserves to be a hero, but it's important not to think that one person can do these things on their own. They have to be talking to other people, listening to other people, building on the work of other people, and allowing other people to build on their work as well.
Yes, and it's a great example of this kind of how freedom, economic freedom, and free markets facilitate and promote the exchange of information through division of labor and specialization, as Adam Smith illustrated. I 100% agree with you about iPencil. Fantastic updating of Adam Smith's great example of the pin factory in Wealth of Nations. But I was really struck by sometimes how strident your tone was in the book about the nature of the collective enterprise of innovation, right? So on page 93, for instance, you say, innovation is not an individual phenomenon, but a collective, incremental, and messy network phenomenon. Now, I agree with you on the particular data. In fact, in this context, you were talking about the invention of the automobile, with Benz and many others contributory features. Sewing machine was the same way. You don't talk about the sewing machine as such, but
I thought of writing about the sewing machine. I never got around to it, but I wish I had. I'd love to hear more about it from you.
Oh, I'm happy to share with you my article, but the easiest way to an academic's heart.
Well, but just on that, interestingly, Ohio is where it started. Am I right? And there's a little bit of a hint that Ohio was a hell of an innovation factory at one point. Not just the Wright brothers, but the sewing machine, but there's a whole bunch of other things come out of it. What was going on in Ohio around the turn of the 20th century?
Well, the sewing machine goes back actually earlier to the early.
It's much earlier than that, isn't it? Yes, of course.
U.S. antebellum era, as we call it, the early 19th century, and it was more in Massachusetts and the East Coast. Massachusetts was actually the Silicon Valley.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So it's right.
Century, but I wanted to, I wonder what you say, that the two responses or reactions I had when I was reading this about the collective enterprise of innovation was that, how do you respond to the the infinite regress problem, to the point that you're conceding a very important premise potentially by accident to this to this position often maintained and probably best represented in the United States by President Obama, when he said, "You didn't build that." Right, to all of the business persons and entrepreneurs, is, you didn't make the roads, you didn't pay for the teachers who educated you and things of this sort, and you couldn't have made the company you made without this underlying infrastructure that was created by other people. And of course, this argument is used not just in the innovation and IP context, but he was using in the real property context, in the tangible world, to undermine and undercut people's claims, legitimate claims, to the fruits of their productive labors. So how do you balance between two notions where, yes, it involves interaction between people, but how do you make sure that this isn't exploited or viewed as a way of undercutting the actual achievements of people like the Wright brothers and others that you identify?
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. And it's a fine line that I've got to tread here to get it right. I'm more interested, obviously, in nailing the myth of the heroic single inventor at this when I'm making that point. But you're right that the word collective has disturbing connotations because of collectivization, the collective farms of the Soviet Union and that kind of thing. So that form of collectivism is clearly a disaster for humankind. And would not produce innovation. Now, what is that form of collectivism? It's the idea that the government knows best. It's essentially a top-down planning thing. So the word collective is wrong. In a sense, I'm trying to reclaim the word collective and say, actually, do you know what? The market system creates a collective, uses a collective mechanism and creates a collective benefit far better than the Soviet top-down government's state-directed system does. And what I think was wrong with Obama's speech, and I do remember that one, is that he was immediately saying, you didn't create that, the government created that. He very specifically, I'm pretty sure if you go on to read it, says, no, it's the government that deserves the credit here. And you hear this argument again and again. You hear it from Mariana Mazzucato here in Europe a lot, that the government created the internet and GPS and the mobile phone and everything. So why on earth are we allowing Apple and Google to profit from government creation, that ordinary people should be getting the profits, etc. And I think that completely misreads history, because government, sure, pours I mean, it takes 40% of our money or more, and I'm very glad some of that money finds its way back into innovation, because it'd be a shame if it didn't, and it would be surprising if it didn't produce some innovations as a consequence. But if you look at the role of government in innovation, it's pretty poor, really, considering the resources it has. And for much of the first half of the 20th century, the US in particular, but also the UK to some extent, Germany and France less so, the government did very little R&D funding. It was done in the private sector, and it worked incredibly well. They were incredibly innovative economies. So, vaccination, the railways, electricity, these were all developed with private initiative. But that doesn't mean they were developed by individualism, by people going off and shutting themselves away from society and trying to do everything themselves. So I think it's quite important for people on the free market end of the spectrum to recognize that most people want to believe in collaboration. They want to believe that that the world isn't devil take the hindmost, individualistic in that sense. So while the individual has a role, it's as part of I think network is the best word here. But you're right to pull me up on that. I think I may have given a little too much ammunition to the other side of the argument in places.
Well, I admire your attempt to reclaim collective from collectivism as a social and political theory. Yes, because as you described, right, what we're really identifying are two things, right? Kind of reclaiming Newton's very famous statement about how if I was able to see further, it was because I was able to stand on the shoulders of giants. So he himself was a giant, and he himself contributed very important work, but it was building upon and further developed in interaction with other scholars of his time.
There's a naughty little theory that was actually a dig at Hooke, Robert Hooke, who he didn't like. He was a very short man.
Right, exactly. It's an excellent example of the multi-layered meaning of phrases that we sometimes lose through historical, given the lack of historical context. But and then also that pushing back against individualism doesn't mean not collaboration. I mean, you can be an individual, firmly embrace the importance of working with and collaborating through the market, through commercial exchanges, your choice of how you use and dispose of your property, your labor with other people.
Absolutely.
Yes, this is Hayek's point about it's several property. It's not one person in isolation. It's people using their property and their legitimate rights of contract and liberty to interact with other people to create division of labor economies and flourishing societies. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I do agree with that, and but one of my interests is not to put off readers who haven't made the journey into the light. And sometimes one can do that by throwing in words that they like, and then they realize you're actually saying something slightly different, but at least you've got their attention.
Well, and it's not a political treatise, right? So
no.
Right.
I mean, some of my points are not particularly pro-market. Well, no, I think most of them are pro-market, but then, they're not particularly comfortable to, as it were, the conservative end of the political spectrum.
Right, and this should be a book that is accessible and understandable and to everyone. And I think that you should build up inductively the case for political freedom and the types of broader theoretical points that we're making, which you're doing in this book, which is
absolutely good. No, I mean, I'm not, to the extent that I've, as it were, used misleading phrases there, it's because the evidence has led me to them, not because I was trying to do something cunning. I've just implied that a few moments ago, and that really isn't the way I think at all.
No, and I don't think that that's the case either in the book. So now I do also, another point in the book, there were so many, so it's hard for me to identify just the various things that I wanted to talk with you about the book, is, your distinction, which is really important distinction between invention and innovation. Now, this is not an original distinction to you. This is something I think historians of technology and others have long recognized. Harold Evans, I learned this from Harold Evans in his book, They Made America.
Mm-hmm.
which is about inventors and innovators itself. So can you describe that a little bit more
Yeah.
and talk
Well,
about?
again, I think I'm going to choose a story to describe that. Samuel Morse was a very famous artist, a very successful artist. And he's on a ship coming back from France to the United States. And he gets into conversation with a physicist who's on the ship about whether or not you can send messages down wires. And the upshot of the conversation is, yes, you probably can. So when he gets back, he decides that instead of being an artist for the rest of his life, he's going to try and invent the telegraph.
Mhm.
And he then sets out to do so, and he runs into every conceivable obstacle, and it doesn't work to start with, and he needs a lot of money, and he has trouble raising it, and he then needs sort of congressional approval to build a line from Baltimore to Washington, and so on. And then the work gangs don't do it right, and he has to start again. And it's a real slog getting the first telegraph up and running. But famously, he then is able to transmit a message, and the world is then takes off. And the guy he talked to back on the ship there then sues him and
Yeah.
says, hang on, you stole that idea from me. And my point is that Morse here is the innovator. The other guy may or may not be the inventor, i.e. the person who had the original idea. But who's done the most work? Who deserves to make the most money out of it? It's Morse. The idea, let's send a message down a wire, is not that difficult to have. It's how to do it that's difficult. And again, I think that the story of innovation teaches that story, that it's what Edison called the 99% of perspiration, not the 1% of inspiration that is necessary to achieve something. And Edison is a very good example, again, of someone who does the hard work of turning inventions into innovations that are practical, reliable, and affordable. That, to me, is what innovation is. It's not having a bright idea. It's making things practical, reliable, and affordable. And I love the story, which I tell in the book. Charles Towns, the inventor of the laser, used to tell it, of the beaver and the rabbit looking at the Hoover Dam, and the beaver says, no, I didn't build it, but it is based on an idea of mine. That's like that guy whose name I've forgotten on the ship with Samuel Morse.
Yeah, I don't recall his name either, but he was a really obstreperous person. Actually, he was involved in a lot of claims against other inventors. He also ended up claiming he invented the use of anesthesia for surgery and
yes, exactly. No, that's right. Yeah, no, I think he was a sort of sort of what he did, really. Yeah.
But this is the real key, and I think this is a really important point of the book, and is how you bridge the gap from invention to innovation, which is so crucial and key because humans have always been inventive. You detail some of the early, even prehistoric innovation. Part of human nature, to be creative and to invent and create. We have to transform the world we live in. We have to create the values that in order to survive, not just survive, but flourish. And so that bridging of how you take something from someone's mind or the lab or the garage and getting it into the marketplace as a practical, usable, something that non-specialists, non-experts, basic consumers, right, can use something. I don't understand all of the physics of 5G, but I benefit very much from my use of my smartphone.
I don't understand any of the physics of 5G. I'm impressed you understand some of it.
So and of course, this takes us, I think, to an important topic that you also address in your book. And of course, I would be it would be inexcusable for me not to mention it since I am chair of the Forum for Intellectual Property. Is that
absolutely? No, I was looking forward to you bringing that up. Yeah.
That there's so much I agree with the book, but I find some of the comments and some of the claims about intellectual property, and particularly patents, which is an area of work I do, and that to be of concern, because not because you're necessarily wrong about the particular details, but for instance, you mention patents as being important to incentivize people to invent, which is kind of the conventional wisdom understanding of what patents do. But if your concern is just getting people to invent, right, getting the person to come up with something in the lab or in the garage, there's lots of ways we can do that. You can do that through tax subsidies, historically,
prizes,
prizes, all sorts of stuff. So, but patents do something different than just incentivize people to invent, because patents, I think, are not a monopoly grant. They arose out of monopoly grants, like all original property rights, even in land. but they have evolved in the modern era. And in fact, this was the U.S. contribution to this. Something that Harold Evans even mentions is we treated them in the U.S. as property rights, right? And so they became the same type of legal entitlement, legal protection that Adam Smith talked about with respect to, property rights in factories and mines with the PIN, as ways of facilitating commercial exchange. So venture capitalists could make investments on the basis of them. You could slice and dice them up and license them and assign them and engage in that incredible divisional labor and specialization economy that arises when you have people exploiting and using their property rights. And so if that is one's perspective of patents, then is it necessarily true that patents are just a block? Or do they serve this important bridge?
Well, I mean, it's all about the nuance, isn't it? We can all agree that some degree of intellectual property is probably helpful. Too much is almost certainly probably unhelpful. In other words, it's where you draw the line and how you set them up and how easy you make a patent to get and how long it lasts and all that kind of thing. So it should be a nuanced discussion in that space. Where I'm coming from is the empirical evidence that I cite in the book that countries which strengthen their patent system don't see an increase in innovation, and countries which hadn't got strong intellectual property systems don't lack innovation generally. And and then you get the phenomena like the patent thicket and the patent troll, where a biotech entrepreneur today, particularly a small one, finds that he can't work on that molecule because it's the method of working on it has been patented and he can't afford to license it, and yet the other guy who owns the patent isn't working on it. He's just profiting from the rent that you're seeking. So I fear they have become opportunities for rent seeking far more than they should be. And that this is where the analogy with physical property to me breaks down, because it's not clear to me that just because the word property is in there, that these things really are property. The whole point of property, my house, the reason that my property rights in my house should be respected is because if I live in it, someone else can't, and vice versa. Whereas the whole point of a patent is to share it, is to be able to open it up to the world so that other people will use it. There's no point in a patent if it's not going to be used by other people as a way of making progress in innovation. And if you go back to the origin of patents, clearly what people are trying to do is stop people hoarding secrets. They're saying, no, instead of hoarding a secret here, publish what you know, and in exchange we'll give you a rent. But if you look at what happens when a patent expires, I talk about the patent on corrugated iron expiring in, I think it was the 1840s. And that results in a huge entrepreneurial burst of innovation in the corrugated iron industry. It happens to be around the time when Australia is getting settled. And so as a result, Australia kind of becomes the capital of corrugated iron, and is rather proud of that title to this day. It didn't have very much in the way of timber to build from instead. But something similar has happened much more recently. A lot of the patents on 3D printing have expired recently, and that has resulted in a burst of innovation in 3D printing. So I think the empirical evidence suggests that we have gone too far in letting patents become barriers to innovation rather than encouragements to innovation. And if we can find a way of pulling them back and reforming them so they don't do that, I would be in favor of it. Is that, I mean, I'm drawing also, I'm very influenced here by people like Brink Lindsay in his book, The Captured Economy, Alex Tabarrok, and people like that. Is that an argument that you see the merits of?
Well, I've engaged with it much, and I appreciate deeply that there's intellectual property is a point of controversy within the libertarian community. Libertarians, right, they tend to be very skeptical of intellectual property, but I have found the historical evidence, the empirical evidence, and the economic evidence to be contrary to the claims. And what you describe is, I think, a lot of conventional wisdom and a lot of claims made by Alex Tabarrok and others. But there's a really great little essay by Stanford political scientist Steve Haber called "Patents and the Wealth of Nations," which actually, it's just a little survey of the economic and historical evidence where he identifies that, look, the same type of correlation that you see between property rights and land and advanced flourishing economies and societies, you see the exact same correlation with patents as long as they're protected as property rights, which means clearly assignable and transferable in the marketplace, as all other property rights are. And enforceable as property rights. So, no contract in the marketplace is possible if you don't have the backstop of an injunction. If you can't say no to someone, you can't have a free market. You can't have a free exchange. You can't say no to the person who wants to come into your house, and you can't become a proper landlord where you can determine the market value of renting your house to that person. So, and that he is not.
What about the other argument which I make in the book, that many of the entrepreneurs who I write about, the innovators who I write about, spent an inordinate amount of their lives battling to defend their patents in the courts. Marconi did this, the Wright brothers did it, Samuel Morse did it, and clearly it consumed a lot of their energy and it drove them mad. And you can't help thinking that you wish they'd been back in the lab instead, inventing a new technology rather than in the courthouse.
Yeah.
And actually, quite a lot of the people who were suing them had a point. In other words, the whole phenomenon of simultaneous invention, 21 different people came up with the idea of the light bulb around the same time. Tons of people came up with the idea of the search engine in the early 1990s. Tells you that ideas are often ripe. They're out there. They're ready to be plucked. And if one person gets a monopoly reward on it and the others don't, that's jolly unfair on the others.
Yeah. So I would part ways with empirical and theoretical. So one is that it's not, there's no more monopoly reward than a person who, two or three people who both pursuing the same parcel of land. One person gets there first and starts to till the soil under our property right system. He or she gets to claim that as their property right, even though the other person says, I was heading for that same parcel. In fact, that argument, by the way, is often used to show it's all arbitrary. We shouldn't have property rights in land. But also, some of the disputes over the patents, first of all, were not from legitimate simultaneous inventors. So, for Morse's telegraph war, as it was called at the time, with O'Reilly. O'Reilly was actually one of his licensees who explicitly pirated his technology.
Right. Yeah, but that's not true in every case, because if you think about the search engine example, you can see how. I'm very interested in simultaneous invention because it seems to be so incredibly obvious in retrospect. That the search engine would be invented.
Because yes, to say, well, ideas are just out there. They still have to be created by someone who puts in the time and effort and energy. But I think the important point is to recognize about patents is that since they're property rights in newly created inventions. So first of all, we often speak colloquially about claiming ideas, but patents don't protect ideas.
No, I realize that.
True, then it would be patent infringement to think of an idea, and it's not.
Yeah.
But that's a real world, tangible process or technology of some type or other. But the point of it having to be new, which is infused, I found historically, with kind of Lockean notions of this is, you're mixing your labor, you're producing something new, and therefore you have an entitlement to it. Naturally there's going to be, first of all, you have two types of problems. One is the desire of people to get it for free, something new that makes their lives better. People want it for free. This is the problem of collectivism, where they convince the government to take it to them, to give it to them for free. But also, because it's new, there's going to be lots of legitimate questions. How do you define the exact boundaries of this new thing? What is this new thing? Oftentimes they're inventing new language. The laser technology, laser was an acronym, as you well remember. A lot of people don't know that anymore. Light amplification of stimulated emission of radiation.
I'm glad you reminded me what it stands for, because I wouldn't have been able to tell you.
So, and it's, And so, and how we in the Anglo-American legal systems have chosen to resolve questions of this nature is through litigation, is through the common law system in which people take their disputes to an objective arbiter, a judge, who operates through the rule of law and set and stable political and legal institutions like courts to effectively resolve the boundary questions. Because one could say the same, you have the exact same phenomenon with real property every time they opened up new swaths of real property, like the Homestead Acts that opened up, the ranges in Oklahoma and Iowa in the United States. There was a massive explosion in litigation in who owned what.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
And so whenever you see new types of property assets being claimed as property, naturally there's going to be some legitimate questions and disputes that arise. But at the end of the day, the key point about property is not that it leads to or can be resolved through litigation. This is the social experience of property. But what people don't see and what goes on beneath the scenes institutionally are the trillions of dollars that exchange hands through venture capitalists, through advanced complex commercial exchanges, distributed, disaggregated value chains with manufacturing being done by multiple different people. And this is all facilitated by, in fact, a lot of this was innovated by Samuel Morse, in part was one of the innovators of a franchise business model. He was able to license his technology to people because he was a professor of art. He didn't have any money and he didn't have the business knowledge or the tech knowledge. And so he joined with Amos Kendall, who was an incredible business person, who created the magnetic telegraph company, who licensed the technology to third parties, essentially innovating a franchise type business model. So, and that's what actually led to the very quick distribution of the electromagnetic telegraph in the United States and eventually through the world in decades. And so this is, this is Adam Smith's insight, right? And this is what patents facilitate. They provide that bridge, the vital commercial bridge through licensing and exchanges, and oftentimes even sometimes free sharing, which is done on the understanding that I'm respecting and recognizing your rights as much as you're respecting mine as well.
Yeah, but then why in certain industries, like an awful lot of what happens in Silicon Valley, do patents not matter very much? On the whole, there's very little profit to be made from patenting software advances because it's very easy to work around. It's changing very fast. By the time you've got to the end of your patent, technology is obsolete anyway. And so you find a lot of skeptics of patents in those industries who say, look, we seem to be able to do plenty of innovation. In fact, we are the most innovative industry in the world by a mile, and we hardly rely on patents at all. And then if you go to if you jump over the fence into copyright, and you say, look what happened with music streaming in the 1990s onwards and Napster and so on, the people with the copyright property in music fought a long, bitter and losing battle against the so-called pirates and ended up joining them because they couldn't beat them. And essentially, copyright in music is relatively hard to enforce these days. And most musicians can no longer sit back and let the money roll in from Hey Jude being played on the radio the way they used to. They have to go out and do live performances or put out their own YouTube videos or whatever it might be. Has that weakening of intellectual property in music resulted in a collapse of innovation in music? I would argue not. And then if I take copyright in writing, very soon after I joined Parliament, a reform of copyright was going through, and I looked at it and I was just gobsmacked. Why are we rushing this through? Well, because the Disney Corporation wants us to, was the right answer, but of course that wasn't the answer I was given. This was essentially saying that you can automatically assert copyright. You don't have to physically assert it. You don't have to print somewhere that I'm asserting my copyright in my book. And it will last for 70 years after the death of the author. Well, how did it get so long? I mean, I'm very glad that I can make a bit of money out of my books, although I think I probably could in a free system with no copyright. But I certainly don't feel I want my grandchildren my great-grandchildren, possibly in 70 years' time, to be making money out of my books. Why should they? You know, what's the point of that? It's not encouraging writing in any sense. So it's all about whether it's gone too far.
Mm-hmm. All right, so there's a lot there.
Yeah, sorry.
I can't get it. No, it's totally fine. I think you're raising really good points. And I'm glad you mentioned copyright because I don't know if I have time or the ability to address that. So I want to just use that though as a bridge to go back to their point about patents in Silicon Valley, which is exactly right. You know, a lot of companies in Silicon Valley don't rely on patents. In the sense that they don't have business models that rely on patents. But the reason why I think it was important you mentioned copyright is because patents are not the sole mechanism by which we protect new valuable assets that are being created through the intellectual and productive endeavors of innovators and creators. You know, the important point is that there's an array of property protections, just like you have intangible assets and property rights in water and in land and in personal goods like trees and even in air and in spectrum. You have copyrights, trademarks, trade secrets. You mentioned the secrecy issues because that's the alternative. If you don't have patents, then people will just try to do trade secrets, and other types of assets. And what that allows for is innovation and creativity in how you choose to structure your business model to deploy the products and assets that you've created, the different types of products and assets. And so if you are creating some types of assets that don't involve a lot of R&D expenditures, and or are a different type of asset than the actual thing like commercial goodwill with your customers, you're not going to rely upon patents. You're going to rely upon trademarks, which is in fact a lot of what the companies do, that they rely upon. But there are companies, but it is also a mistake that the high-tech industry as such doesn't rely upon patents because it depends on who you talk to and what they're doing. So for instance, I mentioned the 5G technology in our smartphones. That arises out of about a 10-year time horizon of R&D, each G, and billions of dollars of R&D. And it's deployed through a business model of licensing. So the creators of 5G aren't making phones. They're licensing that technology to the people. They're embracing that specialization division of labor that Adam Smith taught us about in 1776. And so they do need patents. So, and when you talk to people who develop enterprise software systems, who develop really complex and detailed computer systems more generally, they rely upon patents very importantly to not just for licensing and product development and recoupment of R&D, but they also rely upon patents even when they don't have business methods that don't rely on necessarily licensing as such the technology. So for instance, IBM, which relies now on an open source software business model, they have actually, they're on record with court filings of saying we need patents for our open source. Because one of the important things that patents do, as you mentioned earlier, is publicly discloses. And so if there's a question as to what are you trying to share through the open source community, well, here's an official legal document that says what I'm sharing, what I've made, what I've created. And it gives you an understanding of what I do. They caught a lot of from that, from the open source philosophy aspect of the space, as opposed to the business.
I've had kickback from innovators saying, how can you say we don't need patents? And they've said, I couldn't have possibly started my business without patents because, the investors would never have invested and that kind of thing. And I said, well, yeah, of course, we're in a system where patents matter. And if you're trying to live without patents in a world where everyone else got patents, you're in trouble, So how much of this is because that's the way the world is set up, and therefore it's inevitable rather than because it's necessarily going to work on its own?
Well, this is where I would also recommend other work by some economists like Zarina Khan, who has a really incredible book called The Democratization of Invention.
I should have read that.
Yeah, she's an economic historian. She's at Bowdoin College, chair of the economics department. They're award-winning book. And she has another book coming out this year where she explicitly compares prize systems versus patent systems as which is the better system in terms of promoting and innovation, as we've been talking about, and not inventions. Focusing on historical systems in England and evidence from the World's Fairs in the 19th century. but that is that the point here, it goes back to the point, is that a patent isn't just this initial monopoly grant to incentivize the person to disclose their invention.
Mm-hmm.
It's a property right, because you're right, it originally was a monopoly grant, but so were rights and land, hundreds of years ago. And so the fact that no one would invest in you to build a house if you didn't say, I have a property right in this house, and my collateral for your investment is my property right. And patents serve the same function. In fact, this is repeatedly confirmed for venture capitalists in studies, that they do rely upon patents, not because this is what everyone does, but because this is the property right. This is the thing that they're investing in. And in fact, a lot of people are unaware that, for instance, Sergey Brin and Larry Alexander had got a patent in their search algorithm originally, and there was some indication that they were using the patent pending application as a basis to pitch to VCs for investing in Google.
Oh yeah, indeed. And I mean, I've been working with an entrepreneur on a DNA diagnostic device for some years locally, and very much one of the attractions is to say, and by the way, we have a strong intellectual property position. But you only say that because we're in a world where strong intellectual property positions matter.
I have a strong property right in my house.
Yeah, but there is a difference there, isn't there? Which is that you can use the patent and I can use the patent if I pay for it, but we can't both use your house.
Yeah,
at least not in an exclusive way.
The asset in a house, or the value is secured by a property right in a house, is not dependent solely on the exclusivity or non-rivalrous nature of the asset. In fact, so I teach property law, right? And much of property law, as arose in England originally, right, was overlapping property rights, future interests, rights of use, easements. You get lots of the complex slicing and dicing of overlapping non-rivalrous, non-exclusive use of property rights, water rights, which are very analogous to IP rights in the ways that the property rights are structured, because they're non-rivalrous and non-exclusive at a certain level. Two people can use a stream without interfering with each other.
Right.
Yeah. And so a lot of what the property rights are structured around is trying to secure the particular nature of that particular type of asset, such that it can be used by the person to the benefit of themselves, to the extent that they created or validly acquired from someone else, and that the extent to which they can interact productively with other people, through the civilizing influence, the Deuce capitalism thesis.
Yes. Du commerce. Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry. I know German, not French. My French is awful.
No, fair enough. Yeah, exactly. Yes, Montesquieu. That was, I think.
Right. So yes, and this is and Harold Evans, and as an historian, but also as an economist and political scientist who I found dug into the matters, found a lot of the similar types of things that we've identified about the economic correlations and what has facilitated success and flourishing with respect to other types of property. Right. You see the same type of patterns and the same type of activities when you have properly developed intellectual property systems. Because you're right, they can't be monopoly systems, right?
Yeah.
Yes. They have to be property right systems, and they have to be limited to the nature of the asset being created. It's not a piece of parcel of land. It's not a stream. It's not a tree. And this is why you get the differences, and you even get difference in property rights protections between those types of assets as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's all very interesting. I still think that we have gone a bit too far, or rather, I still think it's an open question as to whether the patent system, as it currently functions, is a hindrance or a help to innovation. And I will need some persuading that it's mainly working as a help. Even where, of course, there's a need to reward the person who spent $1 billion getting a drug through approval and safety trials, even there, you find that actually those profits that come from those blockbuster drugs don't all get spent on R&D. They often get spent on marketing that particular drug so as to make sure to maximize the profits from it. But I can sort of see counter arguments to that as well.
Yeah, well, I hope to continue. This is not the point of this conversation, of course. The point of this conversation is to talk about how innovation works. And this
Well,
is
no, but I've really enjoyed it, and that's very
yeah.
interesting. And you've given me a couple of interesting pointers to go away and read more about.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Matt, for writing a really splendid, interesting, and fascinating book. I highly recommend. Again, I want to hold it up. People should buy it either in dead tree format, in digital
Here's the
Kindle format,
UK edition. Yeah.
or the audio format, and you can listen to the dulcet tones of Matt's voice. For Americans, we enjoy the English accent very much, and listening.
Vice versa. Yeah, I'm married to an American, so I love American voices. Well, look, Adam, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I've probably learned more from you than you have from me, but it's always interesting to do that. And let's talk again. I hope we meet soon.
Oh, I same, and I was, I learned a lot from your book, and I really appreciated the depth of research and effort that you put into it. And I really hope it has a wide readership and is well received. So thank you again, and I hope everyone else enjoyed this conversation. And I look forward to meeting up with you another time.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been really enjoyable.
Thank you.